What if 6 armed soldiers arrested an exhausted, wounded woman who seemed utterly defenseless, only to discover far too late that she was the worst enemy they could have ever encountered? In the autumn of 1944, in a dense forest in northern France, a German patrol surrounded an American woman. She looked like a prisoner, a trophy, a gift from the war, but her identity was a trap. She wasn't a nurse, she wasn't lost, and she wasn't alone. They didn't know her name, but they would never forget what she did. Who was she? And why did the German army try to erase all records of her existence after that day? A unit of 6 German soldiers had been sent to sweep a forested zone near the Allied front line in northern France. It was a common mission, one they had carried out dozens of times before. Capture scattered Allied soldiers, the wounded, deserters, anyone foolish enough to be caught behind enemy lines. They had already detained several men and civilians over the past week, and they were confident, almost bored with the routine. The war had dragged on long enough that missions like this felt more like hunting expeditions than actual combat. The soldiers walked through the dense trees with their rifles slung casually over their shoulders, talking quietly among themselves about food, about letters from home, about when this endless war might finally end. At dawn, as pale light filtered through the canopy above, they spotted a woman in a torn American uniform stumbling between the trees. She appeared disoriented, starving, filthy, with swollen eyes that barely seemed to focus on anything around her. Her uniform hung off her thin frame, stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. She moved slowly, almost drunkenly, one hand pressed against a tree trunk to steady herself. The soldiers stopped talking immediately, their eyes fixed on this unexpected prize. Then they laughed. To them, she was an easy capture, perhaps a nurse who had gotten separated from her unit, or maybe a supply clerk who had panicked and fled during a bombardment. Either way, she represented no threat whatsoever. 2 of the soldiers moved forward to search her, while the others watched with barely concealed contempt and amusement. One of them made a crude joke about American women, and another laughed so hard he had to adjust his helmet. The woman didn't resist their approach. She stood completely still, her eyes cast downward toward the ground, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She looked defeated, broken, like someone who had given up all hope of survival. But her breathing was strangely calm, too calm for someone who should have been terrified. None of them noticed this detail. None of them paid attention to the way her fingers flexed slightly at her sides, or how her weight had shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet. None of them knew that this woman was Lieutenant Evelyn Blackwood, an infiltrated agent of the American Secret Service. In the instant that the first soldier's hand touched her arm, Evelyn exploded into movement, and 6 seconds later, 3 of them were already on the ground. The first soldier never saw what hit him. Evelyn's elbow connected with his throat with surgical precision, crushing his windpipe before he could make a sound. As he fell backward, gasping silently for air that wouldn't come, she had already spun toward the second man, her hand shooting out to grab his rifle and twist it violently to the side. The weapon discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet disappearing harmlessly into the trees. But Evelyn used the momentum to drive her knee into his groin and then her forehead into his face. The crunch of breaking bone echoed through the forest as he collapsed. The third soldier had just enough time to reach for his sidearm before Evelyn closed the distance between them in 2 swift steps. She struck his wrist with the edge of her hand, sending his pistol flying into the underbrush, then swept his legs out from under him with a brutal kick. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs, and before he could recover, Evelyn had already retrieved the fallen pistol and turned to face the remaining 3 soldiers. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds, and the forest had fallen into stunned silence. The 3 men still standing stared in complete shock at their fallen comrades, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The woman who moments ago had appeared barely able to stand was now armed, alert, and moving with the fluid grace of a trained killer. Evelyn was born in Boston, the daughter of a diplomat and a linguist who specialized in codes. Her childhood was unlike that of most American girls in the 1920s. While other children played with dolls and learned embroidery, Evelyn sat at her mother's desk deciphering simple cipher puzzles and listening to her father's stories about international negotiations and the hidden language of diplomacy. Her mother, Margaret Blackwood, had worked for the State Department during the First World War, breaking German codes in a cramped office in Washington. Her father, Thomas Blackwood, had served as an attaché in Berlin and Paris, moving through the elegant circles of European power with the ease of a man born to that world. They raised their daughter to see patterns where others saw chaos, to hear meaning in silence, to understand that the world operated on levels most people never perceived. Even as a teenager, Evelyn was recruited into a secret program focused on cryptography and intelligence. A professor at Harvard had noticed her exceptional performance in mathematics and languages during a summer program for gifted students. He passed her name along to certain people in Washington who were always looking for young minds that could be shaped for special purposes. By the time she was 17, Evelyn was spending her weekends in a nondescript building near the Capitol, learning the fundamentals of code breaking alongside men twice her age. She excelled at everything they taught her. Where others struggled with complex algorithms and foreign grammar, Evelyn moved through the material as if she had been born knowing it. By the age of 22, she already spoke fluent German, French, and Russian, in addition to mastering various forms of martial arts. The language training came naturally to her, building on the foundation her parents had established. The combat training was more difficult, not because she lacked the physical capability, but because her instructors initially refused to take her seriously. Women weren't supposed to learn how to kill with their bare hands, but Evelyn was patient and persistent, and eventually she proved herself capable of defeating men much larger and stronger than herself. She learned judo from a Japanese instructor who had immigrated to California before the war. She studied knife fighting from a former French foreign legionnaire who had seen action in Morocco. She absorbed every technique, every strategy, every lesson about using an opponent's strength against them. She was sent to Europe in 1943 as part of a special cell consisting of invisible women operating in war zones. The program was so classified that even most military commanders didn't know it existed. These women moved through occupied territory, posing as refugees, as nurses, as collaborators, as anything that would allow them access to German communications and installations. They were ghosts, nameless and faceless, performing missions that would never appear in any official record. Evelyn was assigned to France, where her perfect accent and understanding of European culture allowed her to blend seamlessly into the chaos of occupation. She had posed as a Swiss journalist, as a Belgian widow seeking her husband's grave, as a German administrator's French mistress. Each identity was carefully constructed and flawlessly executed. Her mission was to infiltrate German communications and sabotage strategic points throughout occupied France. Over the course of 18 months, she had intercepted dozens of coded messages, identified key supply routes, and provided intelligence that led to successful Allied bombing raids on ammunition depots and fuel reserves. Her record was impeccable. 17 missions successfully completed. Not a single capture, not a single error that might have compromised her identity or endangered her contacts in the resistance. She moved through the shadows of the war like smoke, there one moment and gone the next, always staying one step ahead of the Gestapo agents who hunted foreign operatives with ruthless efficiency. But in September 1944, everything changed when Evelyn received orders to extract information about a secret shipment. Intelligence suggested that the Germans were moving something important, possibly new communication equipment or encryption devices, from a research facility in eastern France to Berlin. The exact contents of the shipment were unknown, but the orders came from high enough up the chain of command that Evelyn understood the mission was critical. To accomplish this task, she would have to cross a forest controlled by German forces, traveling alone without radio contact, and without any possibility of reinforcements if something went wrong. It was the most dangerous assignment she had ever received. On the journey through the forest, she was betrayed by a French contact who revealed her position to the Germans. The man had been working with the resistance for 2 years, and Evelyn had trusted him completely. She never learned whether he had been a German agent all along, or whether they had simply broken him under interrogation. It didn't matter. The result was the same. After 3 days without food, exhausted and genuinely weakened by her ordeal, Evelyn made a calculated decision. She allowed herself to be captured, presenting herself as a helpless victim, while maintaining just enough strength to execute what she knew would come next. After immobilizing the first 3 soldiers with quick and fatal strikes, Evelyn grabbed a knife from the belt of one of the fallen men. The blade was standard German military issue, about 7 inches long, with a leather-wrapped handle worn smooth from use. She tested its weight in her hand for a fraction of a second, her training allowing her to assess the weapon's balance and sharpness instantly. The 3 remaining soldiers were still frozen in shock, their brains struggling to catch up with what their eyes had just witnessed. That momentary paralysis was all the advantage Evelyn needed. She moved before they could fully process the situation, before their hands could steady on their weapons, before fear could sharpen into coordinated action. The other 3 tried to react, but they were not prepared for a woman trained in silent combat. Their training had focused on conventional warfare, on facing enemy soldiers who fought with the same tactics and strategies they had been taught. They knew how to storm trenches, how to advance under covering fire, how to hold defensive positions against overwhelming numbers. But none of that training had prepared them for an opponent who moved like Evelyn did, who seemed to anticipate their movements before they made them, who turned their own instincts and reflexes against them. The 4th soldier managed to unsling his rifle and bring it to bear, but Evelyn was already inside his guard. She swept the barrel aside with her left hand, while driving the knife up under his ribs with her right. He made a wet, gasping sound and collapsed against her, and she lowered him to the ground almost gently before pulling the blade free. Evelyn used the terrain to her advantage, hiding behind trees and using dry leaves as sound traps. The forest became her ally in a way it could never be theirs. She had spent weeks training in wilderness environments, learning to read the landscape, to understand how sound traveled through different types of vegetation, to recognize which surfaces would crunch underfoot and which would remain silent. The German soldiers crashed through the underbrush like wounded animals, making enough noise to alert anyone within 100 yards of their position. Evelyn moved like a shadow, her footsteps landing on moss and soft earth. Her body pressed against tree trunks as she circled around them. She scattered handfuls of dry leaves in their path, creating false trails that crackled loudly when stepped on, drawing their attention in the wrong direction, while she repositioned herself for the next strike. One by one, the soldiers fell, confused, disoriented, and terrified. The 5th man died without ever seeing her, the knife entering the base of his skull as he spun toward a sound she had deliberately created by snapping a branch 20 feet away. He dropped his rifle and fell forward onto his face, dead before his body finished falling. The 6th soldier realized too late that he was alone, that all of his companions were dead or dying, that the woman he had dismissed as a helpless prisoner was systematically hunting him through the forest. Panic seized him completely. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the thunderous pounding of his heart, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, no matter how carefully he tried to step. Every shadow became a threat. Every sound made him whirl around, his rifle pointing at nothing. The last one tried to flee and fire his rifle, but was brought down by Evelyn with a precise strike to the throat. He had made it perhaps 50 yards, running blindly through the trees when she caught up to him. She had followed the obvious trail he left, the broken branches and disturbed earth, and she had moved with the patient confidence of someone who knew the chase was already over. When she was close enough, she picked up a fist-sized stone from the forest floor and threw it hard. It struck him between the shoulder blades with enough force to knock him forward, and as he stumbled and tried to turn, she was there. Her hand chopped into his throat with brutal efficiency, crushing his larynx and cutting off his panicked scream before it could escape. He fell to his knees, clutching at his ruined throat, his eyes wide with terror and incomprehension, and then he pitched forward into the leaves and stopped moving. She remained silent for several minutes afterward, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. She knew that this patrol was not the last, that other German units would be searching these woods, that the missing soldiers would eventually be noticed and their disappearance investigated. Her breathing was controlled and steady, despite the exertion of the past few minutes. She moved among the bodies methodically, checking each one to ensure they were dead, collecting their ammunition and identifying papers. With cold efficiency, she dressed herself in parts of a German uniform taken from one of the soldiers whose build most closely matched her own. The jacket was too large in the shoulders, and the trousers had to be rolled at the ankles, but in the dim light of the forest, it would be enough to create confusion, to buy her a few crucial seconds if she encountered another patrol. Evelyn burned the bodies with gasoline she found in a canteen one of them had been carrying. The fuel had probably been meant for a generator or a field stove, but it served her purpose. She doused each corpse thoroughly, then used matches from her own pocket to set them ablaze. The flames rose quickly, consuming cloth and flesh with hungry efficiency, filling the air with thick black smoke and the sickening smell of burning meat. She watched dispassionately until she was certain the fire had taken hold, that the bodies would be reduced to charred remains that would be difficult to identify. She used false blood from a small vial in her hidden pocket and smeared it across her face and hands, mixing it with real dirt to simulate the appearance of someone who had been wounded and roughly handled. She was preparing herself for a second encounter, already thinking several moves ahead. In the backpack of one of the soldiers, she found maps and coordinates marking an advanced German post. The maps were detailed, showing patrol routes and defensive positions, supply caches and communication lines. It was exactly the kind of intelligence she had been sent to gather, perhaps even more valuable than the information about the mysterious shipment. Evelyn studied the maps carefully, committing the key details to memory before folding them and tucking them inside her stolen uniform. She followed the coordinates on foot, moving deeper into German-controlled territory, heading directly toward the enemy encampment. She was not fleeing to safety, she was advancing toward her mission objective, because that was what she had been trained to do, and because turning back now would mean that 6 men had died for nothing. That night, Evelyn arrived at the advanced post pretending to be a prisoner who had been recaptured by a dead soldier. She approached the perimeter just after dark, when visibility was poor, but not so late that her arrival would seem suspicious. The camp was larger than she had expected, perhaps 40 or 50 men stationed in a clearing that had been carved out of the forest. Wooden structures provided shelter, and sandbag barriers had been erected at strategic points around the perimeter. Guards walked regular patrols with flashlights, and she could see the glow of cigarettes in the darkness, where soldiers stood watch. She waited in the shadows at the edge of the tree line, observing their patterns, timing their movements, looking for the perfect moment to make her approach. When a guard turned his back to light a cigarette, she stumbled out of the forest with her hands raised, calling out in fluent German that she was bringing in a prisoner. Speaking fluent German and using forged documents she had carried in a hidden pocket of her original uniform, she managed to enter as a medical auxiliary. The documents identified her as Greta Hoffmann, a volunteer nurse from Alsace who had been assigned to field hospitals near the front. The papers were excellent forgeries, created by specialists in London who understood every detail of German bureaucracy, down to the specific stamps and signatures that would be expected. The guard at the entrance examined them briefly under the beam of his flashlight, then waved her through without much interest. To him, she was just another exhausted civilian trying to do her part for the war effort. He directed her toward the medical tent with a gesture and returned his attention to the darkness beyond the perimeter. No one suspected anything. She had positioned herself perfectly within the chaos of war, just another face among thousands, unremarkable and forgettable. She spent 3 days inside the camp, observing everything with the trained eye of an intelligence operative. During the day, she assisted the camp doctor with minor medical procedures, bandaging wounds, distributing aspirin, taking temperatures, performing all the mundane tasks expected of a medical auxiliary. She kept her head down and spoke only when spoken to, playing the role of a quiet, competent woman who was simply trying to help. But while her hands worked automatically at medical tasks, her mind was constantly recording information. She noted which officers gave orders and which ones merely followed them. She observed the guard rotation schedules and identified the times when security was most relaxed. She listened to conversations in the mess tent, picking up fragments of information about troop movements and supply shortages. She counted vehicles and weapons, estimated the number of men in the camp, assessed their morale and readiness. She discovered that there was a shipment of codes and radar parts being prepared for transport to Berlin. The information came from a careless conversation she overheard between 2 officers who assumed that a medical auxiliary wouldn't understand the significance of what they were discussing. They spoke about encryption devices and new radar technology that would give the Luftwaffe a critical advantage in detecting Allied bombers. The shipment was scheduled to leave within 48 hours, loaded onto 3 trucks and escorted by a full platoon. More seriously, She learned that the convoy would pass through a village where French resistance fighters were known to be active. The German command had decided to use the convoy as bait, planning to lure the resistance into an ambush and then conduct reprisals against the civilian population. It could provoke a massacre, dozens or perhaps hundreds of innocent people killed in retaliation for resistance activity. Evelyn decided to act immediately. She used the camp's internal radio to send a coded message to the Allies, disguising her transmission as routine medical supply requests that any competent intelligence officer would recognize as containing hidden information. She waited until the radio operator stepped away for his dinner break, then sat down at the equipment as if she belonged there. Her fingers moved across the dials with practiced efficiency, adjusting frequencies and tapping out her message in a code that British intelligence would immediately understand. The entire transmission took less than 90 seconds, and when she finished, she carefully returned all the settings to their original positions and walked away as calmly as if she had simply been checking the time. She planted explosives in the trucks, using materials she had carefully stolen and assembled over the previous 2 days. A bit of blasting cord taken from the engineering supplies, a timing device fashioned from parts of a broken alarm clock she found in the trash, chemical compounds she had extracted from the medical supplies, substances that were harmless separately but became volatile when combined. She worked late at night when most of the camp was asleep, moving through the shadows with absolute confidence, her hands steady and sure as she attached the charges beneath the truck chassis and connected the wires. She created a short circuit that would cut the camp's electrical power at exactly 3 in the morning, plunging everything into darkness at the moment when human alertness was at its lowest point, when even the most disciplined soldiers struggled to stay focused. At the exact planned hour, while everyone slept, she destroyed the main equipment. The explosions tore through the quiet night like thunder, flames erupting from all 3 trucks simultaneously, the force of the blasts shattering windows and knocking men out of their bunks. Shouts of confusion filled the air as soldiers stumbled into the darkness, some only half-dressed, most completely disoriented by the sudden violence. The lights had gone out exactly as planned, and the camp descended into chaos. Officers screamed contradictory orders. Men ran in every direction, some trying to fight fires, others searching for weapons, still others simply trying to understand what was happening. The confusion allowed a resistance cell that had been waiting for the signal to enter the camp. They came through the perimeter at 3 different points, moving with the coordinated precision of fighters who had planned this assault down to the smallest detail. Evelyn led the attack from inside the camp. She had armed herself with weapons taken from the confusion, and she moved through the darkness like an avenging angel, shooting German soldiers who tried to organize a defense, directing resistance fighters toward key targets, creating maximum chaos and destruction. She knew the layout of the camp perfectly after 3 days of observation, and she used that knowledge ruthlessly. When Allied reinforcements arrived an hour later, drawn by the explosions and the coded message she had sent, the post had already been taken. The German officers had either been killed or captured. The encryption devices and radar equipment had been secured. The resistance fighters were already melting back into the forest with their prisoners and captured weapons. Evelyn stood among the burning ruins of the camp, her stolen uniform blackened with smoke, blood on her hands and face, her eyes scanning the darkness for any remaining threats. The mission was complete. Evelyn was extracted from the combat zone by the American Army in absolute silence. A jeep arrived just before dawn, driven by 2 men who didn't speak and didn't ask questions. They handed her a clean uniform and a canteen of water, then drove for 3 hours along back roads that avoided all checkpoints and major routes. She was taken to a farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary command post, where she was debriefed by an intelligence officer who wrote nothing down and whose name she never learned. He listened to her report with an expressionless face, nodding occasionally, asking precise questions about details that only someone with extensive operational experience would think to ask. When she finished, he told her that she had done excellent work, that her actions had saved countless lives and provided intelligence of immeasurable value. Then he told her that none of it had ever happened. Her name did not appear in any official report. The mission was erased from all records, classified at a level so high that even most generals would never know it had occurred. The decision came from the very top of the intelligence apparatus, from men who understood that the existence of operatives like Evelyn had to remain absolutely secret. If the Germans knew that the Americans were infiltrating women deep behind enemy lines, they would change their security procedures, increase their paranoia, make future operations infinitely more difficult. The sacrifice of recognition was the price that had to be paid for continued effectiveness. Evelyn understood this. She had known from the beginning that her service would be invisible, that she would never receive public acknowledgement, that her victories would be celebrated by people who didn't know her name. She accepted it without complaint, because that was the nature of the work she had chosen. The Germans, humiliated by what had happened, reported the attack as an unknown action by saboteurs. Their official reports described a well-coordinated assault by resistance forces, possibly aided by Allied Special Operations troops, but made no mention of the devastating truth that a single woman had orchestrated their defeat from within. The camp commander, who had survived the attack by hiding in a supply bunker, was interrogated extensively about how the enemy had penetrated their security so completely. He had no answers that satisfied his superiors. He could only describe explosions and chaos, resistance fighters seemingly appearing from nowhere, a complete breakdown of order and discipline. 3 generals were relieved of their commands in the aftermath, their careers destroyed by the embarrassment of losing an entire forward post and a critical shipment to what should have been preventable sabotage. None of the soldiers killed in the forest received identified graves. Their bodies had been too badly burned to allow easy identification, and the German military authorities, already overwhelmed by casualties, simply recorded them as missing in action. Their families received brief letters expressing regret and offering vague assurances that their loved ones had died serving the fatherland. No details were provided, no explanations were offered. The truth of how they had died, killed by a woman they had dismissed as helpless, was buried along with their charred remains in unmarked graves somewhere in the forests of France. It was as if they had simply vanished, swallowed by the war that consumed so many others. Evelyn received a secret medal delivered by a general inside an abandoned church. The ceremony, if it could be called that, lasted less than 5 minutes. The general pinned the medal to her uniform jacket, shook her hand, looked her in the eye, and told her that her country owed her a debt that could never be repaid and would never be acknowledged. The medal itself was plain, without any inscription or identifying marks, just a simple silver disc on a ribbon. She was told to keep it hidden, to never display it, to never speak of what it represented. After the general left, she sat alone in the empty church for a long time, holding the medal in her hand, staring at the light filtering through the broken stained glass windows. Then she put the medal in her pocket and walked out into the sunlight, already preparing herself for whatever mission would come next. After the war ended, she disappeared completely. Some said that she went to live in Switzerland, settling into quiet anonymity in a small village in the mountains, far from the cities and the memories of what she had done. Others claimed that she continued her intelligence work during the Cold War, operating in Berlin or Vienna or Prague, still moving through the shadows, still invisible, still serving her country in ways that would never be recorded in history books. There were rumors that she had been seen in Moscow in 1953, in Budapest in 1956, in Havana in 1962, always at the center of events, always influencing outcomes, always disappearing before anyone could confirm her presence. But these were only rumors, stories that intelligence operatives told each other in quiet moments, myths that grew in the absence of facts. Only one photograph of her existed, hidden deep within the archives of the OSS, the predecessor organization to the CIA. The photograph showed a young woman in uniform, her face serious and composed, her eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that was almost unsettling. There was no name attached to the image, no date, no information about where or why it had been taken. It was filed under a classification level that required special authorization just to view, and very few people even knew it was there. Those who did see it often found themselves wondering about the woman in the photograph, about what she had done to earn such secrecy, about what stories lay behind those steady, unflinching eyes. In 1987, an elderly former Nazi officer living in refuge in Argentina wrote something in his personal diary that was discovered after his death. The diary was filled with reminiscences about the war, justifications and rationalizations for decisions he had made, complaints about how history had treated him unfairly. But on one page, written in shaking handwriting that suggested the author's advanced age, was a passage that stood out from all the rest. It read, "The worst thing we did in the war was arrest that woman. She was not human. She was the beginning of our end." He provided no context, no explanation of what he meant or who he was referring to. The passage stood alone, a fragment of memory that haunted him enough to commit to paper, but that he could never fully articulate. Until today, in espionage schools around the world, Evelyn Blackwood is known only as the woman who never existed. Her story is taught as a case study in deep cover operations, in the art of infiltration, in the psychology of becoming invisible. Instructors use her missions as examples of flawless tradecraft, of the ability to adapt and improvise under impossible circumstances, of the kind of courage that operates not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, where true intelligence work happens. But they teach her story without using her real name, without showing that single photograph, without providing any details that might allow someone to trace her actual identity. She remains what she always was, a ghost, a legend, a reminder that the most effective warriors are often the ones that no one ever sees, whose victories are never celebrated, whose sacrifices are never acknowledged, who serve in silence and disappear into history without leaving a trace.